In contrast with the newness of Adelaide, I come from Cambridge in the UK. The university is 802 years old now. We had a great celebration 2 years ago, so 800th anniversary, and it snowed a couple of weeks ago. It's hard to believe I was in snow 2 weeks ago. And I took this photograph of this guy, and then I thought afterwards, this guy represents the European consumer. Okay, he's got a full stomach. The European consumer has never had to worry about food production over the last few years. He goes to the supermarket and the food's always there. He assumes the food's always going to be there. And it's only the last couple of years when there's been some concern about food security. The other thing about the European consumer is he wants to live forever. And because he wants to live forever, he takes a peculiar view of risk. And anything that's perceived as risk, he shies away from. And obviously pesticides is an issue which is possibly a risk. But this distinction between risk and hazard has also disappeared. So they see pesticides now as hazards and rather than risks. And that has shaped our European legislation. And if you don't know the difference between a hazard and a risk, electricity is hazardous, but the risk of using it is low because of all the things we do to make sure the risk is low. But that distinction has gone. The European consumer is also worried about anything that's unnatural. And therefore GMOs are looked at with despair, from my point of view, despair. And also pesticides are not natural, they're synthetic. And yet the only case in recent years of death through primary food production has been quite a mass killing of people in Germany this year from E. coli from eating in the organic restaurant. But at least it was natural. So they could die happy. Right, okay, so that gives you a bit of an angle about where I'm coming from. And this is a bit about the organisation I work for. I think Alan's described it. I work for farmers. I provide information to farmers. I get information for free wherever I can. I've been picking up information here, which I shall give to my farmers' membership. As I pick it up from the rest of Europe as well. And we interpret this information. We probably do a lot of field trials as well to get a finer point on that, and then provide guidelines to farmers. So I'm coming at this as a rather farmer's perspective, as you'd probably hope I would do. Right, just a quick look at UK agriculture, because the other issue about farming in the UK, other than pesticides, which I'll come to in a minute, is that we're a small island with a lot of people on it, 60 million people now in the UK. We farm 70% of the land. So farmers and consumers work alongside each other very closely indeed. And everybody in the UK lives next door to a farm if they live in the countryside, and a lot of people live in the countryside. Fields are small, as you know. A quarter of the farmed area is in crop production, and the main crop is wheat. And I'm going to talk a bit about wheat. We sow our wheat in September, and we harvest it the following August. A long time to accumulate radiation from the sun, and we get good yields. So I'm going to talk a bit about wheat production now. Now, in terms of the weather in the UK, this kind of thing is quite unusual. Another picture of Cambridge. I had a new camera, you know, I couldn't resist it. We had 15 centimetres of snow only a fortnight ago, which is, to say, very unusual for the UK. We have mild winters and we have mild summers. And this is ideal for winter wheat. So we do get some growth of winter wheat over the winter, and we don't get blazing hot summers the next year to kill off the wheat. So you have a long grain-filled period. So the potential for yield is high, and we have to really work hard to make sure we achieve that potential. And if you look at all the world's greatest yielders in terms of wheat, they're all islands. There's the Republic of Ireland, top, New Zealand second, and the UK third. All islands moderated by the sea. So we have mild winters, mild summers. And in fact, if you look at maps, we farm far further away from the equator than the Canadian prairies, but it's that sea that gives us that moderate climate. So if we go to look at the wheat yields in the UK, I put the US down below, but the UK there, as you can see, from 1970 to 2011, we've got an increase in yield, and a significant increase in yield between the mid-70s and the mid-80s. This spans my working career, but I don't take credit for it. But it is quite interesting what happened. I've been asking farmers over here, what was the biggest development that shaped their current farming systems? And many of them have said Roundup. Roundup or glyphosate was the thing that shaped their system today. And I think the same thing has happened in the UK. And in fact, the start of the revolution, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm a weed scientist by background, is that we had effective herbicides introduced in the early 70s. And these herbicides control grass weeds in wheat. So we did see a vast change in wheat production just because of these herbicides alone. We could sow earlier in the autumn when the soil was drier, so we got less soil damage. We had a longer growing season, so the potential yield was higher as well. And we could grow more wheat on the land most suited to wheat production. So that was the first step. Then in the mid-70s, we had semi-dwarf varieties, so we increased the harvest index. The harvest index of our grain now is about 55%. So we had a greater percentage of the above-ground biomass in grain, and that was a big improvement as well. And then in the 1970s, into the 80s, we had effective fungicides, so we could protect the crop against disease, which meant we could put on more nitrogen, and we had the basis of our current system. And our current system has changed little since about the mid-80s in terms of crop protection. The detail has, and we have a big issue now about herbicide resistance and fungicide resistance, and we have to sort of grab and try and retain what we've got rather than be thinking of increasing yields at the moment. So in terms of programmes, we put on 220 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. There's not urea, that's nitrogen, so double it for urea. So we really bang on the nitrogen. We can put up 2 to 4 applications of herbicides on some soils because of grass weed resistance. We put on 3 to 4 applications of fungicides, and we put on some insecticides, some in the autumn for virus control, perhaps one in the summer for aphid control. And so we can spend around £200 a hectare on pesticides. That varies a lot between 150 and 250. So some of you guys can only dream of sales like that per hectare in Australia, but certainly that's what we put on. But it's inevitable, if we're that intensive, there's going to be issues. Issues of concern by the public, real issues in terms of pesticides moving out of fields into water in particular, which is our big issue, and nitrates as well in water, but I won't cover nitrates in water now. Just to make sure we know what we're all talking about, this is what I include in pesticides, all these. There's other ones as well, like barnacle paint on boats and things like that, but certainly when I say pesticides today, I'm talking about the range of materials to protect crops. Now, in terms of pesticide regulations, we had pesticide regulations before the mid-1980s, but the first significant thing that affected the behaviour of the whole industry was our regulations that came in the mid-80s. This does not just include registration, it also included advice, certificates of competence for advisors, and use and monitoring. So since the mid-1980s in the UK, we've had quite a robust system of registration and also use and monitoring of use, and also ensuring there was good advice, competent advice going to farmers throughout the whole industry. And then we were threatened in the late 1990s with a pesticide tax, and therefore we had the voluntary initiative, which many people say was neither voluntary or an initiative, which actually increased the aggro in terms of making sure that we were working responsibly. So we introduced sprayer testing, a national register of spray operators, and competence for spray operators as well as advisors. So we were all the time improving, we think, the background knowledge of those involved in the industry. And then in 1991 we had the first European legislation, which was for registration only. So it didn't include use and monitoring, it was just registration only. And the big issue about that, which we'd never done before, and perhaps we should have done before, there was a 10-yearly review of existing pesticides. So bringing up pesticides have been approved many years ago, originally many years ago, up to modern day standards. And this created a huge fallout in terms of registered pesticides. As I say on the screen there, we lost about 70% of our active substances over the period of review, mainly because manufacturers said the market was so small it wasn't worth going through the cost. It cost about £15 million. What's that? About $25 million to re-register. And therefore a lot of minor crop uses disappeared. We did lose some through revocations. People wanted to reapply and it was done, but most of it was because the market was too small. So we've lost a lot of pesticides in Europe, part of that process. And minor crop usage is a big issue in the UK because of that. Small market crops and crop protection. It looked dire at one time, but answers have been found up to now. And in terms of broadacre cropping, we're still standing. But certainly we've seen a lot of losses of pesticides because of this 10-year review. And then most recently, and this is where we get a bit more concerned, we've had the thematic review in terms of Europe of pesticides. And Europe has really caught up with the UK in many ways because it's not registration only, but it's use and monitoring. So we've had the Sustainable Use Directive, which covers use and monitoring. It's going to affect us little because we were there already to a certain extent, but I'll just cover a bit of that. We've got new registration requirements, and this is where we're losing the science, in my opinion, because we are looking sometimes at hazard rather than risk, and I'll come on to that later. But it also swept in something which is probably of greater influence in Europe, which is the Water Framework Directive. Now, the Water Framework Directive is aimed at improving the quality of water, and a lot of that is to protect water from outside pollution, which could be pesticides, other chemicals, nitrates, phosphates. And we think that bit is going to have a far greater influence on UK farming than the other issues, and I'll explain why in a minute. Now, this is a registration system, and you don't really want to worry about it too much, to say the truth, because it's a simple concept. You think, how can 27 countries have one registration system? And the answer is those 27 countries have an approved list of pesticides in terms of active substances. So there's EU registration of the active substance. And then individual countries or individual zones in Europe will actually register products based on those active substances. So it's a two-way process. Active approved at European level, products approved at a local level. And that's how the system works. It took about 10 years to get going, but it's beginning to work quite nicely now. But there is some concern. It's a bit like a black box. Something might go in the top, but nothing ever comes out the bottom. That is the issue, I'm afraid, with the new legislation. There is great concern that it's taken an awful long time to actually get things approved, and there is some concern about that. Right. Now, the concerns are, as I'm going back to the European consumer, that we're seeing a split between science and people's perception of risk and hazard. And so in the new pesticide legislation, we've got hazard cut-off ratings. So if you reach a certain carcinogen rating or a certain teratogenic rating, despite the fact there might be no risk in practice, those products will be withdrawn from the market. And when you look at those risk ratings, some of them share the same ratings with caffeine, which we all eat, with certain things that occur in celery, and therefore, as you see, the standards are very strict. And obviously the caffeine rating worries me a bit, my love of flat whites, Alan. But certainly there are great concerns that we're getting slightly irrational in our registration process because of this issue of hazard cut-off ratings. And those hazard cut-off ratings might mean we'll lose the triazole fungicides. And that'll be a huge blow to UK farming. A huge blow to UK farming, if that happens. In addition to that, we have the drinking water standards. And these are the standards you can see there, parts per billion, for those who know what PPB in. So an individual pesticide can't exceed 0.1 parts per billion. Now that's a surrogate zero at the time when it was introduced. They can measure far lower levels now, but that was a surrogate zero. And that's a very demanding standard, and we're having a job to meet that standard. Now, luckily, those standards are at the tap. So the water companies can process water, and they do process water to take pesticides out. But many of our key pesticides are occurring at 0.2, 0.3 parts per billion. They're taken out by activated carbon or by ozone. It's a dual process, and they can meet the 0.1 at the tap. But the Drinking Water Directive says from now on, companies can't install additional purification. So if we have a situation where we have problems, the problem source, which might be the pesticide, might have to be withdrawn if things start to get worse. And we have a particular problem with metaldehyde, the slug pellet, because that dual process of activated carbon and ozone doesn't take it out of the water. There's one of two products like that, clopyrrole being another. So we're having real issues about that very demanding target in terms of the Drinking Water Directive. But it only applies in certain parts of the country. Now, the Sustainable Use Directive, I say this really doesn't affect us much in the UK because we had that 1980 legislation. But I've just put this up because there is one thing there, which is Article 12, the reduction of pesticide use. Now, this is a directive. So a directive means individual countries can interpret it to a certain extent in the way they want, as long as it complies with the overall objectives of the directive. A regulation you have to do, a directive you can interpret locally in trying to achieve those aims. So the UK approach to reduction of pesticide use is integrated pest management, which means nothing. So I don't think anything will change, to tell you the truth, because no farmer wants to spend more than he needs to on pesticides. So I'm sure it will lead to little change. In France, it means 50% reduction of pesticides by 2018. In Belgium, it means 25% reduction of pesticide use by 2018. In Denmark, they've had reduction targets for a long time. So individual countries are looking at that one differently. But I think in the UK, we've got a reasonable understanding with government that we're doing the best we can anyway, because the costs and returns of crop production. Right, just back now to water, and from now on I'm going to talk about protecting water, and that leads on to spray drift. Okay, now in the early 2000s the EU made a list of priority substances, those things they thought, if in water, would actually challenge the ecosystems of water. So this is to protect the environment of water. And they listed those pesticides on the left. There were other chemicals on there that were not pesticides, and there were some other minor pesticides as well. But these are the ones they thought would challenge the water environment. And in the UK, we've lost all those over the last 10 years. Mainly because of the challenge to water. It might not be just because of that. Chlorpyrifos got through European stage 1, and they're still trying to get UK registration of that as a product. Diaron is registered in Europe, but we haven't got any products in the UK based on Diaron, I think because of the challenge to water. The UK list, we've only lost diazinon. So the left-hand column, the EU column, is a list of death. And the UK one, we can actually do a bit about it. And I've listed on the right some of the pesticides frequently occur in water, often above the drinking water standard. But the issue about this is where we have a sort of a two-track system of water. We have the environmental quality standard that applies to all water. And obviously the drinking water standard only applies to potable water. So the environmental quality standards are set. Once you're on that list, you have environmental quality standards, and then you have monitoring to see what those levels are in water bodies. And so I'll just go through the environmental quality standards because you might be interested in the sort of standards we have to meet. So the EQS for 2,4-D is short-term. We have a short-term high of 1.3 parts per billion and a long-term of 0.3 parts per billion. And we don't use much 2,4-D in the UK, and we can live with that. We think that's okay. Now, I'm glad you're all sitting down because the next one is cypermethrin, where the standard is 0.1 parts per trillion. So that's 0.0001 parts per billion. Okay, so that's demanding. And I suspect we'll lose cypermethrin in the near future. And we know in the UK that cypermethrin is really toxic to fish. So we can have a short-term burst of as high as 0.4 parts per trillion, but a long-term of 0.1. And then we have a few more which are not so demanding. I think that's dimethoate, that's linearon, again, higher figures, again, figures we can live with. And the mecaprop one is very high indeed. And it's interesting to mention the mecaprop one because this just goes back to some of the way systems work in the UK. The mecaprop one was far more demanding at one time, but it went out to public consultation and the pesticide companies produced data which allowed that level to be raised significantly. So there is an interplay on public consultation in our systems now with open government to actually challenge the decision of legislators. Right, now we have a new list, the one on the left is almost fixed. We're not particularly concerned about those on the left. We use biphenyls to control brassicas in what you call canola, we call oilseed rape. It's not as select as we hope it can be, but there you are. Cypermethrin appears yet again. They got in for cypermethrin. And quinoxafen is the fungicide we use for mildew control, but resistance is taken away from us anyway. The one on the right, as you can see, is a pre-list of a possible consultation list. So it is very early days on that one, but glyphosate's on it. And it probably happened in Australia as well. The green groups have got in for glyphosate in Europe. And any way of challenging and threatening glyphosate. And I think it's on because of that reason alone. I'm hoping eventually, when we have the real list, glyphosate won't be on that list. But glyphosate's on the list at the moment. Methiocarb's on the list, which is probably not unsurprising. And pendimethalin, which we use for blackgrass control, our major grassweed, is on that list. And chlorothalonil is a major fungicide for us, and that's on the list as well. And we do know that chlorothalonil occurs regularly in water in France, so that's a bit of concern about, again, protecting against disease. Now, in terms of our record, these EQSs, this is the sort of higher standards, or the lower standards, I should say, easy to meet standards. Only 1% of our water bodies are failing that. So the EQSs we have are not of a great issue, we think. Obviously, cypermethrin might miss because of that. And the EQSs have meant we've had a lot of products withdrawn because the at registration modelling showed we would exceed those EQSs. But in terms of active live monitoring, we mostly comply with the wider legislation. But when you get to particular smaller areas of drinking water production or collection and sourcing, the record is not so good. And we have a 12% failure rate, and that 12% failure rate is always in arable areas. And therefore, we're going to have this two-speed agriculture in the UK in terms of preventing pesticide movement to water. Those outside the potable water areas and those inside the potable water areas. We're now drawing up maps, or the Environment Agency are drawing up maps to try and isolate where these higher standards have to be met. This is Eastern England, and as you can see, significant parts of East Anglia, our major arable area, will have higher standards to meet in terms of pesticide movement to water, of great concern to those farmers inside those areas. And some farmers are now beginning to look at those and say, is our farm really in this area, and challenge the Environment Agency about movement of water from their farm, which catchment they're actually in. So there's going to be a lot of debate for those farmers on the fringes, trying to show they are outside the area rather than inside the area. But those people inside the area have got very high standards to meet, so we haven't got to comply with 0.1, but we cannot get worse, and they're expecting long-term improvements. So big issues about movement to water. Which leads us on to spray drift, this is one of the methods of moving to water. And of course spray drift can cause short-term excesses of the EQS in a ditch running by the side of a water. Okay, because you get a high load and then it's gone, but you can still exceed that short-term limits which I showed you earlier on in terms of EQSs. And this is getting to a political debate now about really, should we be trying to protect every ditch in every part of the country? If we protect water bodies widely, does it matter about the environmental health of every small ditch on a farm? And it's getting into a political debate. I'm a vice chairman of the British Crop Protection Council, which is an industry body, and we're beginning to lobby the government on this issue, because it does seem vaguely, or really a bit surreal, to try and have such high standards. And I'll explain our concern in the next few slides. This is the kind of spray we use, 24 metre sprayer often. Some people use 32, some use 36 metre sprayers. We generally spray 150 litres per hectare. They're travelling about 12 to 14 kph. Some go 18 kph. We have a problem if these vehicles go too fast, we get vortices behind the sprayer and get poor distribution immediately behind the sprayer. So most people restrict to 12 to 14 kph. This is a typical label we have, and I've obviously picked a new farm label. I'm not a fool. This is for MCPA, and this is as far as it gets at the moment in terms of spray drift. Okay. Now in the UK, when you go for registration, bystander safety, i.e. somebody walking by the side of the field, somebody sitting in the garden, children playing in the garden, nearby vegetation, impact of spray drift is assessed. But we have no buffer zones for that at all. We have no buffer zones for bystander safety, nearby people, nearby gardens. And this label goes as far as it goes in terms of that issue, which is that extreme care must be taken to avoid spray drift. Okay, as far as it goes. What we have are buffer zones for water, and I've emphasised the importance of water to you now. So we have there LIRAP B, and this is our local environmental risk assessment for pesticides. Now this was introduced when I was in the government's independent committee for pesticides in the 1990s. We designed it so it was farmer friendly and rewarded farmers for good practice. And I think legislation should always reward people who comply. I shall explain how we reward farmers in terms of good practice in this one. So we have guidance from the EU saying that spray drift is important, and that's why we had this LIRAP scheme. And all the pesticides now have on the label, just like that MCPA label did, LIRAP B that had. Most products are LIRAP B, vast majority are LIRAP B. But LIRAP A means you have to have a 5 metre buffer zone. I'm only talking about 5 metres, a 5 metre buffer zone, and that has to be observed at all times. You can't reduce the size of that buffer zone. And in reality, when we introduced that legislation, we knew that really should be wider for some pesticides, but we wanted to make sure that farmers adopted this scheme and adopted it with some enthusiasm. Most pesticides are LIRAP B, and this is where you're rewarded for good practice, because if you adopt low drift technology, you can reduce from 5 metres to 1 metre. And I'll explain how we do that. But certainly if you adopt low drift practice, you can go from 5 metres to 1 metre. And there's a few pesticides with no buffer zone requirement at all. And for a schematic of this, I'll go to the next page, but I must say one thing that we don't take into consideration is wind direction. Because we all know if a farmer even had ditches on 4 sides of his field, he'd always apply with the wind blowing away from the water. So well, his records would show that, I should say. So we do not take into account wind direction in our legislation. So this is a schematic which comes from the official guidance, and I've put reference to that in my paper, and it is actually wrong because we cannot grow a crop within 1 metre of the top of a watercourse. It's all part of our compliance regulation. And if we break compliance, we lose our single payment, so farmers comply, I can tell you. So no farmer can grow a crop within 1 metre of the top of a water bank. So the schematic's wrong, but that's a 5 metre buffer zone, and if we can reduce it to 1 metre, i.e. to the edge of the crop, for LIRAP B, for the vast majority of our pesticides. The other things we have to take into account in this risk assessment is the width of the ditch. The wider the ditch, the more dilution there is of a spray drift, so the better it is. So you can have narrow buffer zones. And the dose. So we look at width of the watercourse, dose, and pesticide application method. Now, a lot of farmers, and this is with a frost on the crop, on the field on the farm in the UK I used to manage as part of my job at Morley. And here we installed grass strips alongside watercourses. So many farmers did that to avoid the necessity of doing LIRAPs altogether. And we got paid for those grass strips through a government biodiversity scheme. So we drilled 12 kilometres of those strips. And it didn't seem to help biodiversity that much because we used the same species in all 12 kilometres, but that's another one. But they are. But that was the scheme. And a lot of farmers have done that just to avoid it, and they get payment for that. Not as generous payment as cropping it, but there's a payment involved. But if you do farm up too close to a ditch, you have to use low drift technology for the LIRAP Bs to go down to 1 metre. And the low drift technology is obviously nozzles, pressures, forward speed. And so all our nozzles, although the company's responsibility, they submitted their nozzles for testing to a protocol agreed by government, and all the nozzles are rated 1, 2 or 3 LIRAP. And most farmers use a 3-star LIRAP because it just avoids thinking about the issue. And that means you have a 75% reduction of drift. And once they adopted that for the headlands, they found most of these nozzles work for the rest of the field anyway. They might drive faster in the middle of the field, but certainly they found that these nozzles were perfectly okay. And we did a lot of testing for our membership, and they were very happy with these nozzles, air induction nozzles normally, and so they used the whole, so they didn't have to fiddle around changing nozzles once they'd gone around past the ditch. 5 minutes. Okay, and when farmers are checked whether they're complying with the regulation, the checking is they have to do an assessment, okay, in front of the inspector. They don't say, oh yes, I comply, and here's my records. So they have to explain to the inspector they understand the scheme. These are the kinds of things that appears on the website, and I'll give you reference to the website. So this is for Billericay 03. So to get a 3-star rating, when you go around the outside of the field, you spray at 2 bar pressure, and as you probably know, Billericay doesn't work particularly well at 2 bar pressure. This is for nozzle spacing of 0.5, a forward speed of 8, which is not great, so you have to comply with that on the outside. Forward speed, boom height, nozzle spacings, and pressure. And you can get access to our website easily here to see what the other ones are, if you've got nozzles in common with us, to see if they would comply with these ratings. And this is a chart we use. If you've got a 3-star nozzle, you don't worry about it. If with a LIRAP Bs, you have to do a LIRAP A, you set up a 5 metre buffer zone, but the Bs and the rest, usually if you've got a 3-star nozzle, you've got a 1 metre buffer zone, so you don't think about it. If you've got a standard nozzle, as you can see here, the wider the more the dilution, the less buffer strip you need, and also if you go from full rate to quarter dose, you can reduce the width of the buffer zone. And a 2-star nozzle, I don't know any farmer use a 2-star nozzle, but as you can see, really, most of the cases you can have a 1 metre buffer zone unless you're using full rates alongside a very narrow stream. And please notice, if there's no water in the ditch, we can just go to 1 metre anyway. So there's only complies when there's water in the ditch. And as you know, with our climate, it can happen. Although last year we only had 330 millimetres of rain in Cambridge, so we're not always wet. Okay, then recently we've had larger aquatic zones introduced, and this would happen, of course. It's Sod's Law. I agreed to give this talk on a Monday, say, and on Wednesday this came out. So I thought I got a nice, easy ride with their apps, and suddenly they've run out of nerve in terms of the UK. And it's the UK manufacturers that ran out of nerve, and they asked our registration authority for wider buffer zones to ensure re-registration of some pesticides. So this request actually came from the manufacturers because this increasing standard which we see pervade as the environmental quality standard, they realised with re-registration on pesticides they wouldn't meet that EQS with the current legislation. And so they asked for wider buffer zones. And now we have also interim arrangements for buffer zones up to 20 metres. And if it's between 6 and 20 metres, for some reason, we can't do a LIRAP. We can't do a risk assessment and reduce the width of it, partly because of the interim arrangements. And part of the reason for the interim arrangements is because there is a big issue about what is the science. What is the good science behind risk and spray drift? And there is a big issue which I'm afraid could come and hit us hard on this. It's due to these curves here. In legislation, they use the 90 percentile values, not the 50 percentile values. That means 90% percentile means 90% of values fall below the line. So the lines might be different. I can't get hold of those. But in our current legislation is built on these curves here. This is a fallout of spray as you move away from the nozzle. Okay, the end nozzle. And we use the Ganselmeyer-Routman curves currently in legislation in Europe. There's a European working group to suggest that this is unrealistic, and we know it's unrealistic. When you look at it, it's an 8-metre sprayer travelling at 10 kph. And we might have to move to that model there, which is a Dutch model, which does not much higher until you look at the scale here. And this is a logarithmic scale. So that could be a 10-fold increase in drift. And that could have severe implications in the future for us in terms of spray drift modelling. You all know about boom heights, so I'll zoom through that. So what does all this mean? It's my final slide, Alan. You'll be delighted to know. What does it mean to farmers? What has it meant in the past? Minor crops, we had a lot of worry, but little effect so far from legislation, because we've always managed to find uses with existing pesticides that survive the process. But sometimes they're not totally satisfactory, but we're ticking along. But we're really concerned about the future and the new legislation coming in. In terms of broadacre crops, we've lost some really good pesticides, and we really feel the loss of trifluralin for blackgrass control in wheat, which we surfaced applied, by the way. And we really miss that. And so we've had an increase in costs of requiring that. There's a lot of effort in Europe in minimising point source pollution. That means spray fill areas, spray emptying areas, being careful how you clean your sprayer, where you spray your area, where you clean your sprayer, and things like that. So there's a huge emphasis on good practice on that. And also good practice to reduce diffuse source pollution, which is again buffer strips against watercourses, which probably you normally buffered anyway because of LIRAPs. We've had extra bureaucracy, and now we've got a few extra concerns. We've learned to live with that. We can just about survive with that. But we've got concerns now because of the new registration of available key fungicides in broadacre crops. We'll have to do good practice plus, and we're not quite sure how big the plus is, in those drinking water areas with the higher standards. And we have possibly wider buffer zones impacting on pesticide availability as well. Because some companies are saying, even though it's their request, if it's a 20-metre buffer zone, they're not going to introduce that pesticide. And also got the concern about wider buffer zones. And so just I'll leave you with this final picture, which is some of the initiatives the industry has taken, and some of which I've been involved with, and some of the research I've been involved with, to try and overcome some of these issues. So we've had the voluntary initiative, which is promoting good practice. We've had the H2OK campaign, which is ensuring that farmers know the importance of point source pollution, spray fields, spray cleaning areas, good practice there, as well as in terms of diffuse pollution across there. Real concern about get pellet wise, which is formaldehyde pellets, because you can't clean it out of water, as I say. And there's a current campaign on core PFOS and drift as well. And my company are looking now at some clever bits of spray machinery to overcome some of the shortcomings in minor crops as well. So it's a very dynamic and fluid situation. Many thanks indeed.